From Acres USA, you are listening to the Acres USA podcast, a conversational podcast where we'll explore sustainable farming, regenerative practices, and the latest innovations in eco-agriculture with some of your favorite farmers and ranchers. I'm your host, Taylor Henry, the owner and CEO of Acres USA. Welcome to the Acres USA podcast. So, welcome to today's podcast. We're thrilled to have Mark Kastel, a dedicated advocate for family farmers and organic integrity. After starting his career with Agribusiness Giants, Mark shifted to organic farming in the 1980s, inspired by his own health transformation through an organic diet. Mark's work includes founding M.A. Kastel and Associates, Inc., and co-founding Cornucopia Institute, making him a leading voice in the organic movement. Now, as the executive director of Organic Eye, he continues to champion economic justice for family farmers. Organic Eye was founded to protect the values of the organic farming movement, which emphasizes environmental stewardship, humane animal husbandry, and economic justice for family-scale farmers. Their mission is to ensure these principles are upheld in the modern food system. Visit organiceye.org to support their mission. So, Mark, thank you for inviting me out to your farm. I think it's amazing, my time with Acres, how many local ties have popped up. People are excited about the fact that it's moving to Viroqua. It has moved to Viroqua, and we're putting our warehouse, remodeling a old dairy barn, and that'll be the office space, and then our warehouse is an old machine shed next to it that's getting remodeled, so that's where all the books will be stored. Mark, you have a long history with Acres. I think maybe we should lead off with talking a little bit about what Acres as the organization meant to you, when you first were introduced to it, and some of the experiences you had working with Acres in your past.
Sure. Well, Acres has always been unique in agriculture. There were few periodicals. For a while, Rodale, the gardening, organic gardening magazine was about the only pathway farmers had to look at what organic practices were about, and they kind of merged farming and gardening. Then they published New Farm magazine for a few years, and it was very similar to Acres. I like to say that when I started my career with International Harvester and then the J.I. Case Corporation and FMC, and eventually owned and operated my own Case IH implement business. I was probably the only dealer in the United States that gave Acres and New Farm out to my customers. That was in the day and age where we called sustainable agriculture LISA, low input sustainable agriculture. So the formula was, it's not how much you make, it's how much you keep. So all my customers back in the flatland country of Michigan were all concentrating on how many bushels per acre. Well, the banker was making money, the chemical companies were making money, the implement businesses were making money. Everybody was making money, but the farmer wasn't making that much money. But there was a lot of cheap corn and beans out there. And so the philosophy in eco-farming was, how do we farm in consort with nature, but how do we also create a different economic paradigm? Because family farmers, ever since USDA Secretary Earl Butz told us all to get big or get out, have been losing. And they were losing before that. It was kind of a conspiracy to make food cheap. And I like to say, farmers on food stamps is not an oxymoron. The sad part is that so many families sacrifice their own economic well-being to create food, and it's just a cheap food pipeline. So Acres was a great magazine. It was highly political. We talked about the politics behind the economics of farming, and talked about the integration between health and creating food in a different production model. So I've always been an avid reader, a fan of Charles and Walters, and was a friend of Fred. When Fred ran the paper, I had the honor of doing 2 keynote speeches at Acres USA conferences over the years. I can't really remember where they were. Maybe one was in somewhere in central Illinois. One was in Indianapolis, maybe.
Springfield. I actually saw, I saw the marketing material, and your name was listed as one of the keynotes ahead of some of the most popular folks in the industry now, and you were the headliner.
There were a lot of really good folks involved, and they still are, and many of them are still involved with acres.
They really are, yeah. I mean, well, some of Gabe Brown was on that list as just a farmer from North Dakota, and he's one of the folks that are leading our keynotes this year. So
that's great. So there's a lot of continuity. There's always been a lot of continuity, and so I've met a lot of great folks over the years at Acres conferences, and still see a lot of interesting things in the magazine. So thanks for inviting me to talk today.
Well, thanks for being here. And you had said to me before that you thought the Acres crowd was some of the most political savvy folks that you had run into. Do you think that was just because, Charles Walters made the point that the political areas were mentioned in the magazine and it just attracted that sort of person? One of the recordings from an EcoAg conference, Charles, it was someone else actually that was talking about Charles Walters, and he said that Russ Perot had said that if he'd make it into office, whatever the year was that he made a big push, 2004 maybe, or maybe before that, that Charles would be the Secretary of Ag.
Well, that would have been interesting, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would have been. It would have been interesting.
And we've definitely, under both political parties, had very similar orientations at the U.S.A. Lincoln called it the People's Department. I call it the Agribusiness Department. Joel Salatin calls it U.S.A. And but who runs it? Whether the Democrats or Republicans are in the White House, regardless of which party runs the Senate and House Ag committees, the agribusiness lobbyists are calling the shots. And sadly, that's true in organic agriculture at the USDA as well. We've got the Organic Trade Association, very powerful lobby, kind of masquerading as a public interest group, but they represent the business interests. They represent people who buy from farmers. They don't really represent farmers. There's a few token farmers that they use as poster children, but there's almost no farmers involved. And they present themselves on Capitol Hill as if they represent, as if they're an umbrella group, which is the way OTA started, representing all interests. But it morphed into just another greedy lobby, Washington lobby. And so we've tolerated an attrition of family scale farmers in organics. We formed organics as an alternative, as a vehicle for economic justice, because family farmers were being run out of town. And it worked really well for the first couple decades. We commercialized this in the 80s. Organic agriculture existed before then. But in earnest, it became commercialized. It became available. There were a few events that pushed the consumers to be more aware and demand better food. There was the Alar scare in the, I think, late 70s or early 80s with a growth retardant on apples profiled on 60 Minutes. And very quickly, the little bit of organic produce that was in the market was just gone off the shelves. And it created a great incentive for people to get involved. And the business partners of organic farmers, the original entrepreneurs who started many of the brands and distributors and retailers, they stepped up. And so the economy worked very well. And but now most of the pioneering brands have been bought by, Dean Foods and Smuckers and General Mills and Tyson and ConAgra and Purdue are all big players. And so they want that word that says organic. They want to do whatever the least amount of work they have to do to get that word. So that's where the lobbyists come in. We refer to this as regulatory capture. That the department becomes synonymous with the business lobby. We have that revolving door. So I worked with the Washington Post in breaking one of the largest grain frauds for imported grain in the United States. Before that happened, the Organic Trade Association was just crowing about the integrity of organics. They're just really big cheerleaders for organics. And the USDA, although my work over the this is the 20th anniversary of my doing governmental and corporate watchdog work in the organic market, we would complain about Chinese imports, other fraud. We'd caught, even at that point, we had caught big time fraud coming in from Canada, undercutting grain farmers in the Midwest. We had caught giant factory dairies with thousands of cows confining their cattle as opposed to the law. And even when the USDA concurred, their investigators, they'd let them off the hook. And so right after the expose in the Washington Post, the USDA said, well, we don't have enough money and people. Just before that, they were saying how bulletproof the program was. And the Organic Trade Association, we're going to form a task force to look into this fraud. Well, billions of dollars of fraud had taken place before and after that. And so these big corporations, they care that it says organic. And so if the big livestock producers and the big egg producers are bringing in boatloads of organic grain, as long as it has a piece of paper that says it's organic, that's all they're worried about. The USDA, as long as the certification protocols are adhered to, that's all they're worried about. Whether it's really organic is almost secondary to many of the most powerful figures in organics. So after that incident, and we had filed a legal complaint, ethics complaint against the former director of the National Organic Program at the time, he retired not too long after that. And then he went to work for CCOF, the largest certifier, and he's gone to work for the Organic Trade Association. So there's that revolving door. You do a good job if you're scrutinizing and approving drugs or food safety, and then you go through that door and you end up working for the industry, getting paid a lot more than you did when you were a public servant, a quote, public servant.
What do you think the root of all of this is? Do you think there's so some people will say there's a sinister plan behind the scenes where, they fill us up with cheap food, they're profiting on that, but then there's also a long-term model that they'll profit on the pharmaceutical side of things because the same type of companies own both things. Do you think it's a sinister thing? I usually argue, because I prefer to believe that there's decent people in the world. I think it's usually capitalism run amok, not really even capitalism anymore, but it's just money-hungry folks that can't control themselves.
Well, I would concur. Well, we can have capitalism, or we could have rapacious, unregulated capitalism, which is what we have, or maybe even worse, regulated, where the regulations benefit.
Yeah, it's governmental.
The thieves.
It's government capitalism.
Yeah, it's regulatory capture by the most affluent and investors. So, it's not a coincidence that we have the cheapest food in the world, the cheapest food bar none as a percentage of our gross national product and family budgets, excepting for the least wealthy in our country. We're living high on the hog. So we have the cheapest food in the world and the most expensive health care by multiples. But what are the outcomes of that dynamic? Our life expectancy is going down compared to other developing countries. We have rampant chronic diseases, low birth weights, higher infant mortality than other countries. People's quality of life and general health is not good. And so we would be much better off investing in really high quality food. So is there a conspiracy? Well, when you get to the stock market, the investors know where the profits are going to be, and they apply their funding accordingly. But is there a plan? I don't know that there's a plan. The alternative is for us to take more control of our government. And it's hard because we have this duopoly between the two political parties, and there isn't really a viable alternative for an independent. And when we've seen somebody like Bernie Sanders try to run within one of the two parties, they've conspired against his campaign being viable. So we all own the organic label, and we're all organic watchdogs, not just Organic Eye. So we really have to, and we use the USDA, they work for us. We use, and we're not satisfied with their performance. If we were, Organic Eye wouldn't have to be funded by our members. We use the courts, and most importantly, we use the court of public opinion. We use the marketplace. They all want our money. Mm-hmm. The big guys, the small farmers, the big businesses, the ethical businesses. And so we control that revenue stream. You know, why do some certifiers think it's fine to have dairies with 5,000 to 22,000 head of cattle and pretend and milking them not twice a day? That's hard enough moving out to grass the way the law requires, but milking 3 and 4 times a day for the highest production group. Thousands of cows, not in Wisconsin where it rains, and we've had a lot of rain lately, not in Northern California where it rains 40 inches a year, but in the desert Southwest and Texas, New Mexico, Idaho, where it's really hard to pasture animals. And so why do some certifiers certify that? How about hydroponic production? The law is really clear. The law, not the regulations, the law Congress passed said that we need to, farmers need to, before they're, and obviously the regulations that we're speaking about are integrated into the law. The farmers, before they first receive their organic certification, their Organic Systems Plan, OSP, must illustrate how they're going to, and I'm paraphrasing, but maintain or improve soil fertility. How do you do that without soil? So some certifiers look at the production model for livestock and say, you know, these things can't comply with the spirit and letter of the law. Some outfits look at greenhouses the size of 3 football fields and say that are all automated, that are growing in a liquid fertilizer solution instead of the diversity of the ecosystem in organically managed soil. And they look at that and say, well, that can't be organic. Why others are happy to accept those paychecks. And it's funny that it's the same certifiers that end up involved with seats on the National Organic Standards Board or being employed in Secretary Vilsack's office. There's this Organic Trade Association, giant certifiers, giant agribusinesses, and government all working hand in hand, and it's not serving the farmer. So that's where we all have to step in together. And when we see improprieties, either the ones that are being allowed and misinterpreted, like the livestock factories being certified, that's in plain sight, or the grain handling in the United States or imports that there's been just way too many examples of large-scale, multi-million-dollar frauds for us to be complacent.
What is the driving force? How do they justify certification on the large animal operations like that?
Well, it's all done on paper. There are only a few certifiers that will bless those operations, and you know, they basically farm on paper. They say, well, you know, we're complying with all these regulations. Here's how we're doing it. Here's how we're doing it. But as I said, you can keep logs for grazing, but there's always ways to, somebody like yourself who's an experienced livestock practitioner, you could pretty much tell when the last time cattle been rotated. And I have aerial photography of where they actually are grazing, but there's not enough pasture, so it's just
like they have access to this lot,
right.
But they're not actually using grazing like math to figure out if that even is a big enough space with enough forage, and because all they need to do is show they have access.
It's more, they have to illustrate more than that. In 2004, when I started doing this work, it was right when the owners that started the Horizon dairy label, and they were all almost all CAFOs at that point. They sold that business to Dean Foods, $12 billion a year, the largest milk bottler in the country, and about the same size as Monsanto in terms of revenue. And they in turn took those profits and started Aurora Dairy, which is the largest private label or store brand producer of organic milk, all CAFO produced. And so that's when I launched the Cornucopia Institute with Will Fantle. We could see, I had been a consultant to Organic Valley and was very dedicated to the family farmers that were making a living through forming that co-op. And I could see how the wheels could fall off of organic dairy at that point. And so we filed legal complaints, and because they were confining their cattle, they were bringing in conventional replacement cattle. Here us dumb farmers in Wisconsin were raising organic replacement animals. So I'll ask you, you know a little bit about livestock. What do you feed a baby calf, a heifer calf?
Well, I don't feed them anything. Their mom takes care of them.
No. Well, you're in a beef business.
Yeah.
So
But you're saying for
dairy animals.
Well, most likely they'd be giving them some sort of milk replacement, or.
No, I'm going to correct you. They don't. In fact, they don't. Organic farmers, real organic farmers, feed milk, organic milk, not any kind of milk.
They're like trying to think of the dairies I've been on where it's like the last of the milk, like not the good stuff that leaves.
Well, that's possible.
Yeah.
But in general, depending on the size of your dairy, you're feeding right out of your bulk tank.
Right.
And in conventional farming, they might feed milk from treated animals, treated with antibiotics, but that doesn't happen on organic farms. So we only have grade A, really top quality organic milk. We could sell that. That's what those CAFOs were doing. Organic CAFOs, I have to qualify, I don't think they were organic. When I started looking at this, they were selling all their baby calves off at birth and buying back conventional replacement animals. So the animals they were buying back had been fed milk replacement, usually medicated milk that had drugs that were banned in organics. After they were weaned, they were fed conventional GMO grains. And then, during a year period of time, they were turned into an organic animal, and a year before they freshen. And so, again, family farmers were feeding certified organic milk. They were feeding all the forage and grains that the animals were getting were certified organic. It was a competitive boondoggle.
And the CAFOs were profiting by selling a premium calf that was labeled as organic and probably turning around and buying an animal that was 6 months older that's conventional for almost the same price.
You're old. Or they'd buy there were these heifer ranches that would do the conversion. But that was, the USDA was tolerating all that, and we blew the whistle on it. They found Aurora in violation of 12 tenets of the organic law, including illegal cattle, not grazing, a number of other things. And one of the 12 was selling milk labeled as organic that didn't qualify to be labeled. They let them off the hook. They made them do some changes to their operations, but they weren't fined a cent. They weren't banned from organics. Most family farmers, if they had intentionally cheated, and they used the word, the USDA, willfully, they willfully violated the law. In other words, they knew what the law was. One of the founders of Aurora, big shot in the Organic Trade Association. been around organics a long time. They knew exactly what they were doing. And then they let them off the hook, and today they're producing milk for Walmart and Costco and a lot of the big grocery chains. And so that's what we've been fighting and continue to fight. And so how does that still take place? There's billions of dollars being exchanged, and that has a certain kind of power in Washington. But we haven't quit. We're still legally investigating. We have involved in a lawsuit right now against group certification. Most farmers don't understand. We know that to be certified, to sell something labeled organic, the farm has to be certified. To be certified, you have to be inspected on an annual basis. Unless you're supplying corporate agribusiness and importers, and then we're allowing foreign businesses to be part of a grower group or farmer group or producer group. The business that buys the hazelnuts or the turmeric, or now we're learning soybeans and other commodities. But traditionally this group was designed for things like coffee or cocoa. We're very small subsistence farmers, and the third we're banding together to be certified. But the vision of that 30 years ago when I was involved in those discussions was that it would be an indigenous community or a cooperative that would police themselves. But now we have the businesses that are buying the commodities in charge of supervising their suppliers. None of the farms are certified, and maybe 2% of them are inspected by the certifier. Other than that, we trust this business. And that was the polar opposite of how we envisioned organics working. I was certified organic by O.C.A.A. here in this region when it was voluntary. We were certified because we believed in organic integrity and we believed in certification. And so now that was so-called third-party independent certification, meaning a third party, not the buyer and seller, a certifier, somebody who didn't have an economic interest, coming in and supervising that exchange. Now we have the business that has a profit interest saying, believe us, it's all organic. We've gone out and inspected our suppliers. That's bullshit. And it puts U.S. farmers at a competitive disadvantage. If we're going to allow group certification, it should only be for products we can't create in the United States, and not through a business doing the certification. It should be a certifier involved running the entire process. And so we're still trying to fight this fight at Organic Eye on behalf of the farmers who get their hands dirty and crack a sweat and take economic risks to be involved in this market. So you've asked what the incentive is. The incentive is money. And at every point in the supply chain, there's a potential profit enhancement by either outright fraud, boy, you can really double your money quick, or this subterfuge where it's a conspiracy between the business interests and the USDA to whitewash this industrial process, which really isn't what we would call organic.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting information. I think, when did you see this start shifting? Because I think originally when organics came down the pipe, it was, it moved from sustainable to organics. It probably, did it operate for a few years the way that you had envisioned, the way that, folks had wanted it? And then when did this change? When the regulations started coming in?
Well, it depends on the commodity. California is the largest agricultural producer in our country, and not coincidentally, the largest organic. So we lobbied in the late 1980s for the passage of the Organic Farm Production Act, Organic Food Production Act in Congress. OFPA because we needed a level playing field to expand the industry. And we didn't call it an industry back then. We called it the organic movement. And so there were two problems. Why did, some elder farmers, elder statesmen in the organic community warned us, don't get the government involved. But we didn't really see a way to solve these two problems. One is California was producing most of the fruits and vegetables as they are now. And they had a state statute in place that said, and all the boxes said, certified organic according to California statute XYZ. What that statute said is 1 year you could go out and nuke your field and get rid of all the weed pressure. The next year you could be organic and then rotate back into conventional and use herbicides again.
On a year-by-year basis?
Every other year, wow, if you wanted to. Silly me. I was farming and, burning up diesel fuel and gasoline to cultivate. Sometimes we had to bring in people with a hoe to get rid of, to save a crop. We couldn't produce at that scale in California, and they can't either, without that. And so that was one problem. We had an unlevel competitive playing field. The other problem was we had this Byzantine network of certifiers. There was no reciprocity. They wouldn't recognize each other. So one certifier A, let's say, and I was a consultant to a number of dairies that were doing organic in the early years. And so let's say you want to produce yogurt. And some of your farmers are certified by one certifier, some by the other. That's going to be a problem. Your dairy plant has to be certified by somebody. They're checking the records that all the milk you're buying is actually organic. But what happens if you want to add some strawberries or maple syrup and that's from a different certifier? Some certifiers wouldn't recognize the integrity of those products. It was easy when all we were selling were truck crops from vegetable large garden operations, and maybe fluid milk or yogurt that didn't have anything in it but culture. But as soon as we started, the industry matured and you wanted to have, organic pizza with cheese and tomatoes and wheat, we needed to have this standardization of the definition of what constitutes organic and how the certification process works. And that was the nature of the Organic Foods Production Act, harmonizing all those standards. But that was the goal, and the USDA has really failed miserably because they subcontract way too much to each of these certifiers. That's where you get some doing the livestock factories and some doing group certification and some doing the hydroponic, quote, organic production. And, these are giant automated systems where they can produce multiple crops per year, sealed in a building under artificial light. The pressures we have as farmers, farming in the natural world, are not parallel. Mm-hmm. And the same thing goes for eggs. In dairy, I'm sad to say that as we record this in 2024, we have dairy farmers being forced out of business because they can't compete with the factory dairies. We have grain farmers that can't sell crop from 2022 and 2023. Not only can they not compete with the import prices, which in all too many cases aren't legitimately organic, but they forget about the price. The buyers aren't there. The imports are sucking up all the oxygen out of the room. And so, we're failing in protecting the hardworking people that OFPA was designed by Congress to protect, and that blame is shouldered by the USDA.
It's like a script that's playing out that is done in multiple different industries almost.
Well, Walmart controls 30% of all the grocery sales now.
Yeah.
And in rural America, we now have these dollar stores coming in. We're losing all our grocery stores. So, capitalism works when there's
If it's actually capitalism.
and true competition.
Yeah.
And as soon as we allow, 3 or 4 companies to handle all beef slaughter, and to, produce poultry only under contract and eggs only under contract, the farmers, the laborers have no economic clout, and the market-based participants, the eaters, we don't have a lot of options. And so we're still trying to protect what we built. And there really, for all the doom and gloom I'm articulating, there really are 2 organic labels and 2 systems. A lot of Acres readers are direct marketers. And in the 20 years, I'll say 20 plus years, because it was April 1, the anniversary of my doing this work, and it's been 5 years since we founded the Cornucopia Institute. I'm sorry, 20 years since we founded the Cornucopia Institute, and 5 years since we shifted our energies into organic to continue being as aggressive as we are. I have virtually seen no fraud on locally marketed organic food.
Yeah.
That, when you go to the farmer's market and look the producer in the eye, when you sign up for a CSA box they deliver to your neighborhood every week, you have a relationship. I love it when I travel around the country and people feed me once in a while, and they're really proud, and I even visit farms, but if I'm visiting somebody in the city, they say, oh, all these vegetables, they came from our farm. They were saying it was either their CSA or the farm stand that they patronized. They had a heart connection with those farmers. I don't find fraud there. All the almost 300 member-owned food cooperatives in the country, we don't find fraud there. They know their suppliers, producers. When it just ends up being paper exchanged, that's where fraud comes in. And there are some newer laws that are going to try to tighten that up, but how judiciously will the USDA and the certifiers implement those laws, and how onerous are the new regulations? Are we going to put stricter laws in place to catch the evildoers and then make it so hard for family sale farmers to meet those new paperwork burdens that we force them out of organics? And unfortunately, there are people leaving organic certification for that reason. They're not quitting farming organically, they've quit their certification.
Well, I see it as, because I'm not certified, because I look at it like, why would I? Because I can invite any of our customers out here, we can walk around our pasture, I'll tell them exactly what they eat. I have the morals where we just don't use anything that wouldn't be considered organic certifiable. But then why would I waste the time to get certified if I'm not selling to a certain market? But
and 20 years ago, I would have argued you should be certified.
Yeah.
And the reason is because we're forming a community and we're stronger together. Today, it's harder to make that argument.
Well, I think regenerative agriculture has kind of taken, it's like the wild, wild west where there's no certification, and I think people use that tagline versus using the organics.
Sure, sustainable, natural, regenerative.
It's the next one down the line.
Yeah, it means whatever the sales manager decides it means on any given day.
Yeah.
But I still think there's a value for organic certification. And if you're a medium-sized farmer who wants to access the wholesale marketplace, you need to be certified.
Yeah, for sure.
And so my kitchen has all organic food. I came to organics decades ago, after being virtually disabled from my doctors figured it was pesticide poisoning. And I lived in a cash grain area, operated a business selling sprayers. There were aerial applications. I mean, I was just taking a bath in it. And I was lucky enough to see the country's leading environmental allergist, an MD, who said you should eat organic food. So my kitchen is all organic, but my beef comes from a local producer. It's 100% grass. The only thing that wouldn't qualify is he buys feeder calves.
Yeah.
And in organics, to be certified, that animal must be managed organically with no drugs, with no GMO grain or anything else that mama cow has to be managed organically from the last third of gestation, prior to birth, that new animal. So, and I think that's high integrity. I think there's no reason not to do that. But I have a really good friend who raises excellent beef, and that's where my beef comes from. But he certifies his eggs, and all of his other inputs qualify for organic certification. So, we can make those decisions as a consumer, and farmer direct marketers can make those decisions on a local basis where we have direct relationships. But as soon as we go into a grocery store, you and I are members of the same food co-op in our county seat in Viroqua, Wisconsin. They won't sell anything that's not certified organic. Well, it wouldn't be labeled organic. So their produce section.
We actually sell our meat there, and it's not certified, but they don't label it as such.
Right,
either.
you don't label it as organic. Right. Knowing it's yours, maybe I'll pick some up.
Yeah, well, let me know if you can find it. I'm always curious on where they're putting it, but
okay.
I think, yeah, I mean, this is interesting. Would you be comfortable sharing the medical issues that you got from that and how they came about to just, come to that conclusion that it was possibly from pesticides?
Well, they did testing I was allergic to everything. At that point, it was socially acceptable. I had started this problem before I had my implement business when I was working for corporate America. And I'd be in a big conference room. One person would smoke at 10 a.m. By noon, I had a bad headache. By 2, I had the worst migraine you can imagine. I could barely drive myself home. I couldn't get up to go to work the next day. I couldn't eat supper that evening, couldn't eat breakfast. Maybe by 36 hours later, I could have a light meal. So I was, in terms of being exposed to farm chemicals, I couldn't be anywhere near them. So any kind of synthetic chemical really made me sick at that point. And so that's why they surmised that my immune system had been injured from exposure to synthetic toxins. And so they took me off the foods that we knew I was sensitive to, and they put me on a rotation diet. So eventually I was rotating that in. I had a systemic fungal overgrowth. They put me on a powerful antifungal medication, and then no carbohydrates, no sugars, no alcohol, which turns into sugar, to starve those critters that were overpopulating my digestive tract. And I got better. And I started gardening organically, then I was farming organically, and it became pretty much impossible to sell 400 horsepower four-wheel tractors and chemical sprayers to monocrop producers because I wouldn't eat their food. It wasn't too long ago, in the 50s, a little before my time, virtually every farm in America was organic. It wasn't until after World War II that the companies had geared up to make these herbicides and insecticides to use in areas in the tropics where we were fighting, and they were looking for commercial application. Organics really started not because a lot of toxic chemicals were used, although some were. It was because of synthetic fertilizers, synthetic nitrogen, petroleum-based, were supplanting the normal composts and manures and crop rotations and other fertilizer credits for plow downs and other ways that we managed both soil fertility and insect pressure. And now we're going to do it all through a jug. And the pioneers of organics in the earlier part of the 20th century surmised that there was a nutritional difference in the food. That nitrogen wasn't, you could just concentrate on N, P, and K, but it created empty food. There's a book I recommend by a nutritionist by the name of Bernard Jensen entitled Empty Harvest. And he profiled the work of Weston A. Price. This was before there was a Weston A. Price Foundation. And whereas when they introduced a modern Western diet into other societies where they the indigenous peoples were eating a natural diet, people's teeth all fell out. That was Weston Price's first.
I just saw someone just posted a graphic about that, actually, an article about it, Weston A. Price's studies.
Yeah.
So he went to tribes that had these beautiful teeth that barely even ever brushed their teeth. And then they introduced the diet, and within how long they became essentially
very quickly.
Their mouths became decayed.
Well, and that's what he was a dentist, Dr. Price.
Yeah,
so that's what he was looking at. But then he found it actually changed the facial structure, and then they were having all kinds of other physical problems, and mental health problems that they had never had, and marriage problems. The society's changed radically. And so the early pioneers for organics, they were onto something. And so for a long time, people toiled themselves. And it wasn't until the 80s where there were commercial incentives to say that you could afford to change your farm to organic. And for a change, farmers had always been price takers. We had this cheap food system in this country, and we got whatever was left. For a change, we were going to set the price. NFO, Natural Farmers Organization, used to have the mantra, cost of production plus a reasonable profit. So for once, the level of remuneration was going to be determined. We don't tell General Motors how much to charge us, or for Ford for our new vehicle.
Right.
They set the price. So producers, we need to cover our costs. There's no reason we shouldn't have the same benefits that working people in cities have, health care and without government subsidies, and have a little money to put away for retirement or send your kids to school. And so for once in organics, that's what the deal was. And it worked very well, to answer one of your previous questions, for about the first 20 years, where the industry was built on this loving collaboration between farmers and consumers. And it worked well because as the corporations came in, there was a shortage of almost everything, as the growth of the industry was meteoric. And so they were really respectful for farmers, and they were willing to pay. And then the growth started flattening out, and the demand flattened out for two reasons. One, they were all profiteering and charging too much. And two, they started figuring out how to apply the industrial agricultural model to organic production, and pretty soon we didn't have shortages. We had either equilibrium or gluts of certain commodities.
Well, Mark, I think I know we're getting close to your time, but what is and you've covered a lot of it.
By the way, we can always do this again. You're welcome anytime.
Yeah, absolutely. Give our listeners and me, what's some hope?
Sure.
What's something that positive that either consumers or farmers can do, and then what's something that's positive currently?
Well, a community organizer used to say there are only two kinds of power: money and people, and we have the people. So part of our tactics at Organic Eye is educating the public. We're all evangelists. We're all believers in what truly ecological agriculture can do for our local economies, the national economy. We're all going broke because of healthcare expenses, and in terms of protecting the environment and overall quality of life. So everyone who watches this and everybody who reads Acres is involved in something we should all be really proud of. And so now the challenge is twofold. One, everybody listening is one of Organic Eye's intelligence agents. The saying, see something, say something. If something doesn't look quite kosher, it probably isn't. And agriculturalists are the experts, not the young people that graduated a few years ago from college and went through a training to be an inspector, and not somebody in Washington, D.C. that never gets mud or shit on their shoes. And so you folks are the eyes and ears. What's going on out there? If either you see something that doesn't look like it's really organic and it's being represented as organic, or the pricing in your market is impossible. That's where we've busted some big frauds, because the people get greedy. If they just were small, and if they charged about the same price, they could cheat, maybe get away with it. But they get really large, and they start trading in millions of dollars, and they start undercutting everybody's pricing in a way that really couldn't be organic. And whether it's imports or domestic, that's where our eyes and ears out in the field can come in. So that's our power, knowledge, and then our communicating with consumers. They are on our side. They respect farmers. Used car salesmen, politicians, not so much. Farmers, widely respected. So let's protect our local markets. If you find something going on that is non-competitive, that seems to be problematic, let us know at Organic Eye. We have a toll-free number for tips. We hold everyone's information in strict confidence. It's all confidential. You need to identify yourself to us. We're not in the rumor business, but we will never identify you to anyone else. And so together we have power. That's the positive point. And we're not quitting. We own this label. There still is the majority, they might not be the biggest, but the majority of organic farmers are highly ethical, complying with the spirit and letter of the law. Let's all work together to make sure they aren't competitively disadvantaged.
Absolutely. We can get behind that. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate your time and hope we can chat again soon. Thank you for listening to the Acres USA podcast, a podcast production of Acres USA. Find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Play, and other popular podcast platforms. Acres USA is North America's oldest publisher on production-scale organic and regenerative farming. For more than 50 years, our mission has been to help farmers, ranchers, and market gardeners grow food profitably, regeneratively, and with nature in mind. Find our books and other Acres USA media and learn about Acres USA events at acresusa.com. Read our online magazine at members.acresusa.com, and we'd like to thank Acres USA staff for their contributions to producing this podcast. This episode was edited and engineered by Kennedy Stroessel and Weston Larson of Acres USA. We're grateful to our guests for taking the time to talk with us about their experiences.